There are moments in history when a single act speaks louder than 100 speeches. In the early hours before sunrise, in the quiet northern region of Burkina Faso, that moment came without warning. 2 missiles struck a rural outpost, killing 3 people and destroying a vital communications tower. It was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. And it challenged something far deeper than borders. It questioned sovereignty itself. Within hours, President Ibrahim Traoré addressed the nation. Calm but resolute, he declared the strike an attack on the dignity of a people determined to govern themselves. His words did not fade. They spread across cities and borders, carried by radio waves, conversations, and conviction. In Ouagadougou, thousands gathered in Revolution Square. Burkinan citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, not in rage, but in defiance. Their voices rose not only for Burkina Faso, but for an Africa that remembers too well the pain of being spoken over. In Bamako, Conakry, Dakar, and Nairobi, something began to stir. People asked themselves the same question. If a sovereign African state can be targeted without consent or consequence, then who among us is truly safe? The United States called it a counter-terror operation. But to many Africans, the justification sounded painfully familiar. Another chapter in a long history of decisions made elsewhere, for reasons never fully explained. This time, however, the silence did not hold. Across the continent, that moment awakened something deeper than outrage. It stirred memory, unity, and a hunger for dignity. Because sovereignty is not about the size of your army. It is about being heard when you say no. And if that word can be ignored, then what meaning remains? From that morning on, the conversation changed. Not only in parliaments or press rooms, but in streets, homes, and hearts. A question once whispered is now being asked aloud. Who decides the value of an African voice? And how long will Africans wait for permission to speak it? The strike did not come during conflict or in response to provocation. It arrived without dialogue, without warning, just as the sun was preparing to rise. At 5:42 a.m., 2 precision-guided missiles landed on a rural outpost in Yatenga province, a quiet northern region of Burkina Faso. The outpost served as a communications link between remote security posts and the central command. It was not a battlefield, it was a relay station. Within seconds, flames engulfed the structure. By the time emergency responders reached the site, 3 people were dead, 2 soldiers and a local civilian technician. 7 others were injured. The tower, which helped connect the entire northern border network, was reduced to twisted metal. The shock traveled faster than fire. Within an hour, the Ministry of Defense confirmed what many feared. The strike had originated from a U.S. military base in Niger, over 600 kilometers away. It was not coordinated with Burkinan officials. It was not authorized. There had been no joint operation, no shared intelligence. It was a unilateral act. The government cited Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, declaring it a direct violation of the national sovereignty. Traoré's administration placed all military forces on high alert. Border security along Mali and Niger was reinforced with 200 additional troops. Defense points in Ouagadougou and Ouagadougou escalated to DEFCON 2 readiness. But the state did not respond with aggression. It responded with communication. Traoré appeared live on national television later that day. His speech was measured but firm. He told the nation that the strike was not simply an attack on a facility. It was a challenge to the idea that African states can control their own destinies. His calm tone was not weakness. It was deliberate, designed to steady the people and signal to the world that Burkina Faso would respond as a sovereign nation, not a subject. That evening, a wave of coordinated demonstrations began. In the capital, Revolution Square filled with over 30,000 people. They carried signs. They sang. They held each other. They did not riot. They stood. The message was not rage, it was unity. In the hours that followed, similar gatherings emerged in Bamako, Conakry, Accra, and even Nairobi. Not all were massive, but they shared a single message. Africa is not silent. On local radio shows, citizens demanded answers. Was Burkina Faso being punished for leaving Western security agreements? Was the strike a warning to others considering the same path? News anchors in Dakar and Addis Ababa posed the question live on air. Was this a show of strength or a desperate attempt to retain influence in a region that is shifting away from old alliances? While these questions echoed in homes and streets, another front was mobilizing. Civil society groups called for clarity. Local journalists requested transparency about the nature of the alleged threat the U.S. claimed to have neutralized. Were there terrorists? Who were they? Why was there no shared briefing with Burkinan officials? No answers came, no photos, no names, no independent verification. That silence became part of the story. And the story kept growing. Within 24 hours, African news platforms began rolling coverage under one unified headline: the strike that woke the continent. On social media, Burkinan hashtags merged with Pan-African calls for unity. The phrase, "our land, our right," began trending from Lomé to Luanda. For the first time in years, African commentary was not merely reactive. It was organized, persistent, and deeply personal. The government kept its response disciplined. Military presence increased around critical infrastructure, but martial law was not declared. Instead, ministers were dispatched to speak with citizens, explain the situation, and listen. State television provided real-time updates. In neighborhoods closest to the strike zone, schools were closed for 48 hours, and trauma support teams were sent to local clinics. But the central government did something more subtle, something long missing in past crises. It made the people feel included. It spoke not only to defend itself, but to affirm that the country's sovereignty was not negotiable, not just in treaties, but in daily life. And through that message, something rare happened. The population, battered but not broken, responded with calm, with discipline, and with something the rest of the world had not expected: resolve. As night fell on the day of the strike, the world began to respond, but not in the way its architects had likely imagined. The African Union convened an emergency session, one of the fastest in its history. Within 18 hours of the incident, foreign ministers from 42 nations had joined a virtual summit. The message from nearly every delegation was clear. This was not just Burkina Faso's problem. This was Africa's moment of reckoning. When President Ibrahim Traoré addressed the summit via secure video, his image filled the massive conference hall in Addis Ababa. His tone was deliberate, his words precise, but the steel in his voice could not be missed. "If the sovereignty of one African state can be violated without consequence," he said, "then none of us are truly sovereign." That line struck a nerve. Across the continent, governments scrambled to release statements. Mali, Nigeria, Guinea, nations with recent histories of tension with Western powers, condemned the strike in the strongest terms. Senegal and Ghana, typically more cautious in their alignment with U.S. policy, urged Washington to explain its actions and reaffirm its respect for African independence. In the streets, the language was less diplomatic but more powerful. In Bamako, an estimated 50,000 demonstrators filled Independence Avenue, waving both Burkinan and Malian flags. In Conakry, a candlelight vigil honored the 3 victims of the strike. In Nairobi, where the United States holds one of its largest diplomatic footprints on the continent, small but vocal groups marched to the embassy, demanding accountability. Radio call-in shows across the continent were overwhelmed. Citizens who had never before spoken on politics now voiced questions that struck at the heart of post-colonial Africa. Why does sovereignty feel conditional? Why are partnerships so one-sided? And when will African lives stop being collateral in someone else's war? While Western media framed the story through the lens of terrorism and regional instability, African outlets focused on sovereignty, memory, and justice. The contrast revealed not just a media gap, but a moral one. For many Africans, the strike was not simply about Burkina Faso. It was about centuries of control, interrupted only briefly, and now continuing under new banners. In Washington, the Pentagon held a press briefing, claiming the strike had neutralized a high-level extremist threat. Yet when pressed, no names, no affiliations, and no visuals were provided. That lack of transparency only deepened suspicion. In New York, Burkina Faso's ambassador to the United Nations demanded an emergency Security Council session. The meeting lasted over 3 hours. Russia and China condemned the strike outright, calling it a violation of the UN Charter. France called for calm on all sides, a response many Africans saw as hedging to protect its own waning influence. Germany and Italy issued mild concern, while Brazil and Malaysia expressed worry over the precedent being set. But perhaps the most unexpected reaction came not from governments, but from the diaspora. In Paris, London, and New York, rallies formed within days. African activists, students, and professionals filled public squares carrying signs that read, "Respect African sovereignty," and "No more silent wars." They were not large in number, but they were organized, multilingual, and impossible to ignore. Interviews with protesters revealed a deeper narrative, one of betrayal. Many had believed in the values of the countries they now lived in. But the silence from those governments in response to the strike made them question whether African voices were ever truly heard. On African soil, the shock began turning into structure. Pan-African policy groups proposed the creation of a Continental Rapid Response Diplomatic Team to investigate and challenge foreign military actions. The African Bar Association issued a legal opinion declaring the strike a breach of international law. And in cities across the Sahel, murals appeared overnight. Young artists painted scenes of resistance, unity, and a continent watching, no longer asleep. For the first time in a generation, an event had pierced through the fatigue of politics and touched something elemental. Dignity, the right to stand, the right to be asked, not ordered. And the unspoken truth behind it all, that this strike may have aimed to weaken a country, but it awakened a continent. In the days that followed the strike, life in Burkina Faso changed in ways that went far beyond military orders or diplomatic statements. In Ouagadougou, checkpoints multiplied. Armed soldiers once stationed at borders now stood in pairs outside schools, government buildings, and fuel depots. The tone of the capital shifted. It was neither panic nor chaos. It was focus. A kind of collective alertness, quiet but sharp, spreading through daily life. Local radios no longer played morning music. They opened with defense updates. State television ran nightly briefings not only from military commanders, but from ministers of health, trade, and education. Across northern provinces closest to the strike zone, local administrators closed schools for safety. Parents kept their children indoors while markets reopened with visible security patrols nearby. In Ouagadougou, just 50 kilometers from where the missiles landed, people gathered in town halls organized by the Ministry of Information. They were not told what to believe. They were shown what had happened. Photos of the strike damage, maps, satellite tracking data. And then they were asked, "What questions do you have?" This approach surprised many. For a country so recently emerging from political volatility, the choice to lead with transparency and public inclusion was unexpected. But it worked. Instead of fueling rumors, it clarified fears. People were scared, yes, but they were not confused. In fact, they were more informed than they had been during any past crisis. And that sense of clarity had a political cost for the opposition. Opposition leaders who initially criticized the government's security handling quickly found themselves sidelined. Not through censorship, but through irrelevance. Public sentiment had coalesced behind Traoré, not just as a president, but as a defender. A national survey conducted 5 days after the strike by the Ouagadougou Institute of Public Opinion showed his approval rating had jumped from 62% to 81%. Among young people under 35, it was even higher, nearly 90%. That same week, the Ministry of Trade introduced emergency economic stabilization measures. Fuel prices, which had risen 12% in a single day due to panic buying, were capped. Grain imports from neighboring Ghana and Togo were prioritized to prevent shortages. Though the supply lines were strained, they held. Inflation remained under control. This economic calm had an equally political consequence. It cut off one of the usual sources of unrest. When people have food, fuel, and clarity, they do not march in frustration. They organize in purpose. And so they did. Across university campuses in Bobo Dioulasso and Ouagadougou, students formed discussion groups, hosted panels, and drafted resolutions. They wanted to understand the strike, not just as an event, but as a symbol. In churches and mosques, sermons quietly shifted from theology to sovereignty. Religious leaders urged communities to remain disciplined, informed, and united. The moral language of faith merged with the political language of independence. But the government did not merely bask in public support. It moved. Traoré's cabinet initiated a legal review of all existing military cooperation agreements with foreign powers. Some were suspended immediately. Others were rewritten to require full mutual consent before any foreign force could operate within Burkinan territory. The National Assembly, typically slow to react in moments of crisis, passed a sovereignty bill with near unanimous support. The law formally restricted foreign surveillance activities without local authorization. More importantly, it granted greater funding to domestic intelligence operations, with a focus on training young analysts and engineers. This had a long overdue consequence, professionalizing an under-resourced sector and reducing dependency on Western intelligence partnerships. Internationally, these moves sent a message. But internally, they sent something more powerful, a sense of momentum. That Burkina Faso was not only reacting, it was repositioning. Within civil society, this shift sparked new creativity. Writers, musicians, and artists responded in their own ways. In downtown Ouagadougou, a theater troupe performed a play titled Permission Denied, recounting the strike and its aftermath through the eyes of a market woman. On local radio, a popular griot released a spoken word piece comparing Traoré to a lion surrounded by jackals. And in primary schools, teachers gently explained the events to children using illustrated maps and storytelling, not to instill fear, but understanding. The political effect was unmistakable. Traoré, once seen as a transitional figure, now held the presence of a statesman, not by changing his tone, but by staying consistent when pressure mounted. His administration had found strength not through retaliation, but through restraint, unity, and clarity. And in doing so, it laid the foundation for something few expected after a foreign strike: renewed domestic confidence in the state itself. In Washington, the Burkina Faso strike became an unexpected flashpoint. The Pentagon insisted it was a precision anti-terrorist operation based on regional intelligence. Yet when questioned by reporters, officials offered no names, no photographs, and no post-strike assessments. A closed-door briefing to the Senate Armed Services Committee produced more concern than clarity. Senator Mark Rutledge of Illinois, a veteran voice on foreign policy, warned publicly that military actions carried out in sovereign nations without consent set a dangerous precedent, not just strategically, but morally. Inside the State Department, diplomats scrambled to control the narrative. They emphasized that the United States remained committed to African security and prosperity. But behind the scenes, several officials admitted frustration. Burkina Faso had not been briefed in advance. Neither had the African Union, and the lack of coordination was now fueling backlash not only in Africa, but among partners in Latin America and Asia. In Europe, reactions were cautious. France, still reeling from its own setbacks in the Sahel, issued a carefully worded statement calling for calm and dialogue. Germany expressed concern over the erosion of trust in multilateral security arrangements. Italy echoed those sentiments. Russia and China, however, wasted no time. Both nations condemned the strike outright, framing it as neo-imperial aggression. Russian state media broadcast special reports praising Traoré's calm leadership and warning African audiences against renewed Western military presence. Chinese diplomats used the moment to call for stronger South-South cooperation. Even Brazil and Malaysia voiced discomfort, warning that such actions risked undermining global norms. At the United Nations, debate was heated. Burkina Faso's representative called the strike a clear violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter. Western diplomats appeared divided. The United Kingdom remained largely silent. Canada urged restraint. African representatives, however, were united in tone. Their statements did not merely criticize the United States. They questioned the structure of global security itself. Why were some nations allowed to act unilaterally while others were expected to justify every move? This tension rippled into the media landscape. While American outlets focused on potential extremist threats, African and Latin American platforms prioritized sovereignty. The editorial divide revealed something deeper: two versions of global order, now in direct conflict. The world was watching Burkina Faso not just as a country under threat, but as a mirror reflecting who gets to decide what justice means in international affairs. The missiles that struck Burkina Faso may have landed on a remote outpost, but the tremor they caused traveled much further. It rattled assumptions, awakened questions, and tested the foundations of what the world calls order. For the Burkinan people, the event marked a dividing line. Before, there had been uncertainty. After, there was clarity. Not just about their government's choices, but about their own place in the world. They saw what happens when a nation chooses to walk alone, how the skies may darken, how silence may follow, but also how dignity can be found not in size, but in resolve. Across Africa, citizens watched closely. Some cheered, some questioned, but none remained untouched. And outside Africa, in boardrooms, parliaments, and think tanks, the question grew louder. What does it mean when a young African nation is punished not for chaos, but for choosing control? What message does that send to others quietly planning their own paths? The answers remain uncertain, but one thing is clear. Something has shifted. The narrative that once painted Africa as a passive actor is being rewritten. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Not by diplomats, but by citizens. Not in press releases, but in protest chants, village forums, and late-night radio calls. The people are asking harder questions. They are listening to different voices. And they are no longer waiting for permission to decide what justice looks like. Ibrahim Traoré did not declare victory. He did not promise revenge. He stood still and let the world look at a leader who refused to flinch. Some will call that dangerous. Others will call it necessary. But no one can say it was empty. In the weeks since the strike, something has remained in the air. Attention, yes, but also a kind of awareness. That sovereignty is not about flags or speeches, but about who has the final word when danger arrives. And maybe the final question is not what Burkina Faso will do next, but what the rest of us will allow to be done in our name. Please share if you believe sovereignty should not depend on where a nation stands on the global map. Subscribe if you believe Africa deserves the right to speak before it is spoken for.